So welcome to the Hani, Lindiwe Hani, daughter of Chris, the South African Communist Party representatives who Hani's political home, members of other political organizations, the leadership of the university, SRC, members of council, and others who have joined us for what, as I said, is an historic event for the university and something that we are exceedingly proud of. So we do have quite a long program, so I'm going to try and move through it as quickly as possible. I'm going to first invite the chair of our naming of Buildings Committee, who is also who's also a member of the University Council, Mr. Norman Arendse, to just give you a brief overview as to the work of the naming of Buildings Committee and other initiatives that are underway at the university. Norman?
Thank you, Russell, Program Director. May I also add my warm wishes and welcome, especially to Lindiwe Hani. It's an honor and a privilege to be in your company and to be here today. To Justice Sachs, an old friend of this university, an alumnus of this university, and to Jeremy Cronin, also spent many years here doing his subversive best to convert some of us who were here in the late 70s at this university. So a very warm welcome to the Vice-Chancellor and the senior members of the executive, and to the Vice-Chancellor-elect, who's also here. Welcome, very warm welcome. Comrades from the party and other political formations. Sheila, you also? Okay. Is Sheila a council member or comrade? You know? Okay, perfect. Comrade council member. And to the council members here present, and to students and staff, welcome. I'm obviously not going to expand too much on the reasons and the purpose behind the renaming, and save to address you in more general terms. But it was in August 2014 that Comrade Somya, then of SASCO on the SRC, had proposed the renaming of the new Science Lecture Theatre to be renamed as the Chris Hani Lecture Theatre. And the main motivation was that that was the last public venue space where he addressed an audience just before his assassination, and Council approved it in August 2015. Just an overview and a background to what we do as the Naming of Buildings Committee, and also welcome to my colleagues and comrades who sit on that committee. Over the years, since 2008, several rooms, buildings, lecture theatres, conference rooms, and open spaces have been renamed after men and women, black and white, who have contributed much to the transformation that has taken place and taken root in our society, and who have contributed to the non-racial project promised by our Constitution. Archie Mafeji, Ivan Toms, Dumo Bakwa, Adil Murat, Francis Ames, Dalla Omar, Neville Alexander, more recently A.C. Jordan and Harold Cressy. More recently also, the Jamison Memorial Hall was renamed the Memorial Hall, and currently the committee is in a process of consultation with the Khoisan traditional community to rename it the Sarah Bartman Assembly. The purpose of the committee is to identify appropriate names for buildings, residences, open spaces, lecture halls, rooms, roads, sporting facilities, and so on, to promote the UCT transformation and decolonization vision and mission statement in accordance with a strategic plan that was adopted by the current council for the period covering 2016 through to 2020. Central to this plan is the forging of a new inclusive identity for UCT that consciously addresses the inequalities of the past within and beyond the university, and which fully embraces our African identity within the global higher education landscape. We are committed to radically accelerating transformation, decolonization, and thereby enhance the reputation of the university by building on legacy. Needless to say, by permitting us to name or rename one of our buildings after an iconic figure such as Chris Hani, this plays a central role in building on this legacy. Chris Hani embodied all that we have attempted to achieve until now and that we wish to achieve going forward. No doubt other speakers will address you on this important aspect. Our work takes place against the backdrop of widespread social action on campuses across the country, focused on redressing inequalities, prejudices, and structural disadvantages that continue to characterize our society and universities. Our goal is to forge a new inclusive identity that reflects cultures, values, heritage, and epistemologies of the diversity of university staff and students, and that reaches out beyond the physical university campus to all our communities, especially those previously and still currently disadvantaged. Thank you very much.
Thank you much for that. As the chair of the Naming of Buildings Committee indicated, the proposal for the renaming actually came from SASCO. So I think it is... So I think it's only appropriate that we invite the chairperson of SASCO to say a few words. Is he here? Anati Katewa? Ah, there he is. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak on the behalf not of SASC, but on the behalf of the students of this institution. So I would like to thank you, Program Director, for this opportunity. I'd like to also greet with great humbleness to the Chris Hani family that's here today with us. Comrade Lindiwe, we see you. Thank you so much for being here today. We also like to greet the Deputy Secretary General of the SACP, Comrade Soli. Also the Deputy Minister of Public Works, Comrade Jeremy Cronin. Comrade Max Price, we also see you today. We're not fighting with you. We're not fighting with you, Comrade. Our incoming Vice Chancellor, Umama Pakeng, congratulations on your appointment, Ma'am. We are very happy about it. And also to the members of council and the members of management that are here today with us. So my job here is to basically give a word of support for the renaming of this building. But it would be very disingenuous of me to say that simply naming a building to Chris Hani is going to bring about transformation and decolonization into this institution, when the structure that we actually still live under in this institution is one of oppressive nature. What we must seek, and what Comrade Chris Hani seeked, is actually the restructuring of this institution to ensure that black students that are from Khayelitsha, Kukuletu, have access into this institution. We must understand that when we say that we want to reach a socialist society, Comrade Chris Hani spoke about how socialism is not about heavy theory, it's not about ideology, but it's about the simple things in life. It's about shelter for those that do not have shelter. It's about food for those that are hungry. It's about free education for those that need education. It's about healthcare for those that need healthcare. If we do not have the basics in our society, then we have completely failed the society. But we welcome the renaming of this institute, of the building, to Comrade Chris Hani. But in that, we need to ensure that the kind of academics that are taught in that space is one of a decolonial nature that is actually welcoming to the space within South Africa as well. We cannot be taught constantly European exported forms of knowledge in a space whereby we are in an African context. We must learn things that are relevant to us and that are going to ensure that we actually propel our country forward. We cannot continuously be exporting knowledge or importing knowledge and importing our resources to build our nation. We cannot allow European people to constantly come into our nation and tell us how to actually groom ourselves and to grow ourselves within our space. But we must understand that it is our duty. It is our duty as young people, it is our duty as students to ensure that by the time that we graduate, we do not rush to the Constantias and the Cliftons and the Camps Bay, but we go back to the township and we make the suburbs in our township. We ensure that the people in our township have a space and the opportunity to come to the same institution that we came to without actually the oppressive means, because by the time that we leave this space, it will be free, and we will ensure that each and every single student that comes here has the ability to learn and also have knowledge that they can take back to the community and ensure that we grow our nation, not as a united, not as a divided force, but united as one force. Black, white, Indian, colored, we are non-racial in our stance, but the only way that we can realize liberation and emancipation of our people is if we actually come to the acknowledgement that there are certain things within the society that has been created that first have to fall. Those things first have to be fall, and those, once they have fallen, then we can start seeing a society and a country that each and every single person can be part and parcel of our growth. Comrades, I'm not here to give a lecture or anything of that sort. But in that, I would just like to thank the university, Comrade Max Price in New Living. Goodbye, Dad. But we'd just like to thank you so much, and also the director of the Renamings Committee for taking up this initiative of calling this building, it's a monument in essence actually, into Comrade Chris Hani, because he was a commander, not just of the SACP or the ANC, but as a commander of this nation. He ensured that we actually see liberation. He took us to a certain extent of the struggle. Now it is our duty as young people to take it further. There are certain inequalities that we still have to fight in our country, but we cannot do that divided. Let us unite as one and actually see that through, and that we can create a society in the country which is inclusive of all. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you very much. Can I call Mr. Ngomazulu, the president of the SRC? A few words. On behalf of the SRC.
Thank you, Program Director. This is the real voice of the student. To the Vice President of the SRC, Masqole Mlandu, to the Vice Chancellor of the University, Dr. Max Price, to the family of Mr. Chris Hani, all protocol observed, and welcome to the University of Cape Town. It is an honor to be here today as the SRC to honor and celebrate the life of one of the best leaders South Africa have ever produced, Mr. Chris Hani. Chris Hani played a big role in this country in making sure that the spirit and the emancipation of black people is being attained, not just by the theory, or it is also being practical, it is also being practical, not just things that are being said in the public space, but something that we can actually see as a I'm sorry, my English just went away. Yeah, but I don't want to make a political space here, but I just want to say, in the spirit of Chris Hani, will urge the university to drop all the charges against the student leaders so that Chris Hani in his grave will also celebrate this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Can I ask that we bring a chair forward here, because I'm going to ask Albie Sachs to come and say a few words. And Albie had a very close and particular relationship with Chris, which I'm sure he will speak about. Albie?
I was in the underground with Chris Hani, but we were overground. We used to meet up in Newlands Forest, up on the mountainside. So it was the overground, underground. And he was actually a fabulous organizer. And his close mate and comrade, Archie Sebeko, died just this last week. And Archie had come down garage by garage as a petrol pump attendant. It took him a couple of years to reach Cape Town. Chris had been expelled from Fort Hare. Fort Hare is very proud of Nelson Mandela was expelled from Fort Hare. Oliver Tambo was expelled from Fort Hare. And now they can add Chris Hani was expelled from Fort Hare. But he had a connection with UCT. I'm going to mention two examples, part of our history. Norman, I want you to close your ears for what I'm going to say now. I was defending Chris Hani. He was charged with furthering the aims of the ANC, a banned organization, sentenced to, I think, 2 years imprisonment. We took the case on appeal. We got the worst possible judges, and we had some pretty bad judges, and the appeal was rejected. And Chris said, because of the Sobukwe provision that people could be detained after they'd served sentences, he's not going to jail. He won't be allowed out. He said he wants to escape, and I was his advocate. And I broke the bar rules, don't report me. I helped one of my clients to escape justice. It was Chris Hani. But that was in the pursuit of justice. I followed the bar rules, except for the one that said you're not allowed to take clients without paying. You have to report, thou shalt charge your clients, was rule number 1. I broke that rule, but this was now very serious, could have been very serious, helping a client to escape from prison. The problem was, where could he go? And the only house that I was able to find, a place of accommodation of somebody who I could trust, was a student at UCT who happens to be in the audience here today. I don't think he was in an underground cell, but he was somebody we could really rely on. And I said, Peter Simon, could you put up Archie and Chris? And he wasn't Chris then, he was Martin Hani then. Martin Hani, just for 1 or 2 days. And 1 or 2 days became 1 or 2 weeks, and 1 or 2 weeks became several weeks. And Chris and Archie are not the kind of people who like just being in a room. They couldn't even go out for a walk. They hated that. We got messages through. And it was hard to escape from Cape Town. From Joburg, you could go to then Basutoland. You could go to Swaziland. You could go to Bechuanaland, as they were called then. Cape Town, you had to escape from Cape Town to Joburg before you could escape there. And eventually they escaped. Then he wasn't, now he's Chris Hani, the name. Then he was just another one of the comrades. And Peter, would you mind standing up? Somebody... So it was a student of UCT, part of the opposition to the whole fabric of apartheid South Africa, who hid Chris Hani and enabled him to escape and enabled him to become the brilliant leader. The second and last story I'm going to mention was now a couple of years later, and we're back in South Africa, and we had a big meeting in, I'll call it Jammy. At that stage it was Jammy. And what was terrific, the very people that the previous speaker mentioned came in lorry loads from, it was then Langa, from Nyanga. I think Guguletu had just been started then. And we had a lot of students there as well. It really was people from the townships and the students coming together, sitting in the hall, and excited because Chris Hani was going to address them. And Chris he was at that stage very worried about too much peace, being too soft. And he decided to quote William Shakespeare. He loved Shakespeare, he loved literature. He had no problems. As a proud African, he was entitled to the culture of the world and to enjoy the culture of the world. And he told the story of Macbeth. And he starts off with Act 1, Scene 1, and the three sangomas, and he's telling the story of double toil and trouble, and he gets so caught up in it that 10 minutes have passed, and he's still only in Act 1, Scene 1. And so he leaps to the end where Lady Macbeth, now he cuts out all the drama and the blood and the gore and so on, and the main point he wanted to make was Lady Macbeth, who'd spurred her husband on to kill the king, to take over the throne, found there was blood on her hands, a spot on her hands, out, damn spot, and she couldn't get that spot out. And he's saying the people with blood on their hands in South Africa can't just by naming and renaming and, if you like, get rid of the spot that's on their hand. I should mention that a couple of years, not so very long afterwards, he changed in relation to the importance of negotiations. And the thing that got him to change was the fighting in what was then called the East Rand, when the young lions were fighting the Azapo youth and killing each other. And he said, it's too much killing. It's too much killing. We've got to make negotiations work. And he was very, very strong on that. So there's a beautiful, to my mind, beautiful connection with UCT. It's very wonderful to see his name here. Names do matter. They're not everything. They're not a substitute for other things, but they do matter. And they're there because people have struggled. They're not there because a few intellectuals had an idea, wouldn't it be nice? They're there in response to people struggling. We got our Constitution through struggle, and we'll be able to implement the promise of the Constitution through struggle. I believe I can honestly say that is the message of the presence of Chris Hani, his spirit and his name in this university. Thank you.
Thank you, Albi. I remember when we also had another event here in Memorial Hall. You also told us a story of another activist who you had helped, Philip Khosana. So it seems as if there's a long history of subversion. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, Dr. Max Price, I'm going to invite him to come and address us.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, Master of Ceremonies. Colleagues, I could say all protocol observed, but I do want to recognize how many people have made the effort to come. And so I am going to mention many by name. And it's also a way of honoring the contribution they've made to this event. First, Advocate Norman Aronser, who's the chair of the Naming of Buildings Committee, and as you heard, is a member of council. And the decision of naming of buildings is a council decision. And I'm really honored that so many external members of council, members who are not just part of the university, have come to this event. Some have come through all the way from Johannesburg, Buyani Zwane and Ezra Davids, Sheila Basel, Diana Yach, Dr. Shoaib Manjra, and then the internal members of the council. I want to pay a special welcome to the Vice-Chancellor Designate, Mamakgethi Phakeng, the Deputy Vice-Chancellors, Professors Ferris and Leroux, Deans and Executive Directors who are here, the Deputy Chair of the Naming of Buildings Committee, Ms. Edwina Brooks, who will also do the vote of thanks, the SACP President, Mtobisi Mngomezulu, Chair of SASCO, who has spoken to us, Mr. Anati Katya, the Hani family, and Lindiwe Hani, it is really a privilege to have you with us. We're sorry your mom isn't with us, but you're representing the family and, of course, are the person to represent them. the Deputy Minister of Public Works and SACP Executive, Mr. Jeremy Cronin, Justice Albie Sachs, students, staff members, ladies and gentlemen. In recognition of Chris Hani's contribution to South African democracy, the UCT, University of Cape Town celebrates his life and legacy by renaming the new Science Lecture Theatre. The lecture theatre, and it's actually the building which is to be built. We have one already, and some of you went on the tour of that, but it's going to be demolished and rebuilt with many additional facilities. Chris Hani was actually born Martin Tembisile, undoubtedly one of South Africa's foremost anti-apartheid struggle veterans. Born in 1942 in Hofimvaba in the former Transkei in the Eastern Cape. He was one of that amazing cohort of students that matriculated at Lovedale, where he matriculated in 1958. He attended Fort Hare from 1959 to 1961, and then in 1962 graduated from Rhodes University in Grahamstown with a BA in Latin and English. And I think when we think about who we choose to honor, one of the qualities that we often look for is people who have been inspired by their academic education, investment, and who have remained intellectuals throughout their lives. And certainly this foundation that Chris Hani had and the example quoted of his quoting Shakespeare highlight that element of his personality. The introduction of Bantu education by the apartheid government in 1954, that famous quote from Verwoerd that we should not teach black people the Bantu to do mathematics, they should be taught and trained to do artisan labor. When that was introduced, Hani was doing his secondary education, and it paved the way for his involvement in the struggle. He cited the conviction of the ANC leaders in the 1956 treason trial as his primary motivation for joining the struggle, and he became a member of the ANC Youth League in 1957. Hani was arrested at a police roadblock in 1962 while in possession of pamphlets objecting to the government's policy of detention without trial. He was subsequently charged under the Suppression of Communism Act and jailed. And while out on jail in 1963, you've just heard the story, he went underground before leaving the country to undergo military training. After the unbanning of the ANC and the SACP on the 2nd of February 1990, Hani returned to South Africa, where he campaigned for the SACP in the townships around the country. But on the 10th of April, a year later, 3 years after returning, but on the 10th of April 1993, as he returned to his home in Dawn Park in Boksburg, Hani was assassinated. We have, in a sense, timed this. The decision you heard to rename this science block was actually taken in 2014, 2015. You heard that it was nominated to the Naming of Buildings Committee in 2014, approved by Council in 2015. You may ask why the naming is happening in 2018, and it was because we wanted to link it to the 25th anniversary of his assassination, which of course is this month, that anniversary. Why this particular building to name after Chris Hani? Well, the most significant reason was in fact that it was the last place in which he gave a lecture at UCT, the New Science Lecture Theatre, a couple of months before he was assassinated, an event which was remembered by many at the time, but made all the more memorable and etched into people's memories because of the fact that he was killed just a few months after, and they felt so privileged to have met him, to have listened to him in person, this iconic figure from the struggle days, this public enemy number one of the apartheid government, and to have had the opportunity to hear him speak in person. The question of changing names of buildings, as Advocate Arendse mentioned, is part of the transformation program, and he ran through a list of names. I'm going to take some of them slightly more slowly because I'm not sure if it was clear to you that the list he gave were names of rooms and buildings and spaces that have been renamed over the past 20 years. We are in the Molly Blackburn Hall, one of the members of the anti-apartheid struggle as well, who died very young, killed very young. We have the Sissy Gould Plaza just outside. We have the Steve Biko building, which is just also outside. The Hurikwacha building. So these reflect, just in those four that I've mentioned, an attempt to recognize people who contributed to the struggle, languages that are indigenous to the country and reflect different heritages, people who were possibly first the real natives of this country, the Khoisan, and people who came here, who were brought here as slaves, people who contributed significantly to the education of a new generation of students at UCT, such as Harold Cressy, people who became leaders, often UCT alumni, but became leaders of our society, such as Dalla Omar, people fighting a range of different struggles, such as the AIDS struggle and the struggle against AIDS denialism, like Ivan Toms. After Madiba's death, we renamed the road that circumvents the upper campus, Madiba Circle. A new student building, sometimes we name for the function, the spirit, the theme of a building. So Masingeni was named just 2 years ago. And more recently, the Neville Alexander Humanities Building. Just a month ago, the Arts Block was renamed after Professor A.C. Jordan, who was an eminent black scholar, the first black scholar to be appointed at UCT, and made a huge contribution to African languages and literature. So these namings of buildings are not neutral acts. They are ways of making the society, this campus, more inclusive, of ensuring that students and staff recognize themselves in the spaces, in the buildings. I might mention that this is being held in the Molly Blackburn Hall, but it was only this week that we rehung the art that you see around us. This was some of the art that was taken down and some was destroyed in the protests 3 years ago, 2016, 2 years ago. And we've been through a process of rethinking the art on the walls, curating new exhibitions, all of which is contributing to ensuring that UCT feels like, that people feel like they belong, and that it feels like a place that is not just the birthright of one part of the community, but is the birthright and the home of the many different communities that are represented here. So perhaps one of the most important renamings I've left because, again, Advocate Arendse mentioned it, which is the Jamison Hall. The council has already decided to take off the name Jamison, so that it is now called the Memorial Hall, and we're in the process of reconsidering a new name for it. In short, we're delighted that this renaming today, contributing to the transformation of our university, is also an opportunity to recognize someone whose values are so important to the university, someone who displayed leadership, enormous courage, commitment to a cause and to a struggle, someone who did become a martyr, someone who brought intellectual sharpness to the debates within the Communist Party, within the ANC, and someone who led by example and who was at the forefront of that struggle. I hope and trust that his values will be the values that imbue our students and our staff for generations to come, and this sort of memorial is a really fitting way to recognize that. And once again, we thank the family for allowing us to put his name on one of our buildings. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. So when we was planning this event, and I spoke to Mrs. Hani and said this is what the university would like to do, and obviously we needed to get the permission of the family. And I said to her, we actually do want to have an official launch of the event, and we really want to make it a sort of special occasion. And I asked her, so who would you want us to invite to give what we can call a keynote address? And without any hesitation, she said, Jeremy Cronin. And I immediately contacted Jeremy, and he was gracious enough to immediately accept. So, Jeremy, we are really thrilled and invite you to come and speak.
Thank you very much, Russell, Program Director. Lindiwe, it's great to have you with us, and warm greetings to your mum. Albie Sachs, what a wonderful, warm message. Vice-Chancellor, Max Sisulu, thank you also for driving this process as the Vice-Chancellor. To the Vice-Chancellor, Mamokgethi Phokeng. They told me, you noticed Russell's hesitation. He said, I was invited to give a keynote address. So I got very excited and I prepared a 50-minute input. And then when I looked at the program, it said 10 minutes. And I was going to quote Mamokgethi Phokeng, who in one of the interviews that I read recently had a wonderful phrase which said, is UCT trying to be the best in Africa or the best for Africa? And I thought that was a wonderful nuance to the issue. Anyway, so there you are. I have quoted it, and I hope that the rest of my speech is also in the spirit of that wonderful statement. All of the university councillors who are present and members of the UCT leadership, my SACP comrades, you see, they think they're the vanguard party, so they've all sat in the front. It doesn't work like that spatially, but in particular, obviously, the first Deputy General Secretary of the Communist Party, Comrade Solly Mapayile, who's leading the delegation, Nobala. I used to be his first Deputy General Secretary. Now it's a pleasure to welcome him. To the SASCO comrade and to the SRC president, I think Comrade Chris would have been extremely proud of this new generation that is coming through. I think it was wonderful messages that you gave us. I'm sure I'm leaving out many friends and comrades, but to all who are here, students, friends, and comrades, it's a great honor for me to have been asked by the Hani family to speak on their behalf at this renaming event. Now, this isn't, in fact, one of the most daunting speaking engagements that I ever had. I was also deployed by a member of the Hani family. Okay. It was June 1992. And it was the immediate aftermath of that terrible Boipatong massacre in the Vaal Triangle. IFP hostel dwellers from the nearby KwaMandala hostel had been escorted into Boipatong, an informal settlement, by police in armored vehicles. And they then went on a killing spree with pangas, assegais, and even with rifles. And some 49 people were killed, including a 2-year-old child that was stabbed to death in its mother's arms. At the time, the context was that the CODESA multi-party negotiations were deadlocked. The apartheid regime obstinately refused to give way to the principle, the key demand that the ANC and its alliance partners were making at those negotiations. That what we want first is non-racial, one person, one vote elections that would then establish the basis in order to have a representative constituent assembly in order to draw up the constitution for a new South Africa. What the National Party apartheid regime wanted was to first draw up in Kempton Park the new constitution for South Africa before having one person, one vote representative democratic elections in our country for obvious reasons. They wanted a negotiated constitution rather than a democratic constitution. And so the negotiations were stalled. And faced with this obduracy and with growing popular impatience from our own ranks, I was one of the negotiators at CODESA. And when I would go and brief branches of the ANC and SACP and COSATU locals and so on, so what was going on, people were growingly skeptical about the negotiations process. They'd say, we saw you having tea and biscuits. I don't know, they were obsessed with this. Tea and biscuits with F.W. de Klerk on the TV. You know, we are getting killed here. And that is exactly the issue that was happening. Okay. So the ANC and its alliance partners decided that in order to unlock the deadlock, what we would do would be to launch rolling mass actions in favor of serious negotiations and breaking the deadlock. But the regime, of course, the apartheid regime, had other ideas. And on the very eve then of the planned launch of these mass actions, the Boipatong massacre was unfurled. Now, we're told that South Africans miraculously achieved a peaceful, negotiated settlement. It wasn't peaceful. With the commencement of the negotiations process, political violence actually soared. The numbers of people dying, which were terrible in the 1980s, from 1991, 1992, the levels of violence soared. And this was very much part of the regime's deliberate two-track negotiations strategy, to speak to the ANC over the table, but to kick violently underneath. Okay. And Chris Hani played a really leading role at this time in identifying this as a low-intensity conflict strategy, drawn from the dark arts of colonial and imperialist interventions throughout the Third World. The regime armed, it trained, it commanded, and often, as in Boipatong, it escorted proxy forces, Askaris, sometimes Wittuka, sometimes here in the Western Cape, hostel dwellers, to sow mayhem in ANC supporting communities and to further deepen the sense of skepticism about the negotiations. And the regime then used its control over the SABC and its Stratcom disinformation network to present the killings as black-on-black violence, telling its white constituency and the rest of the world, you see what would happen if we let them take over the running of this country. Okay, so it was a very insidious and nasty thing. Well, some of us were in an SACP meeting, a Central Committee meeting in Soweto. We still used to meet in Soweto, by the way, Comrade Solly. Hani was there, Comrade Joe Slover was there, and others, when we got this terrible news of the Boipatong massacre that had just happened. And Comrade Chris, being Chris, immediately left our meeting to rush to the still smoldering and very volatile and dangerous situation of Boipatong. And in the following days, there were spontaneous gatherings, particularly in the Vaal Triangle and on the East Rand and these volatile places. And there was massive anger, as you can imagine, and a popular call to abandon the negotiations. Comrades wanted to take up arms. We want to go back to the bush, as they used to say. And there was talk even of revenge against attacks against IFP hostels, dominated hostels. So Comrade Chris Hani, with his strong MK credentials, was deployed into these angry, volatile gatherings. And he carried a clear message. He said, we share your anger. He was not dismissive of the anger and frustration that people were feeling. But let's not be manipulated, he said. Let's be clear-headed. Spontaneous acts of revenge, he would say, will simply play into the regime's agenda. Our objective must be to mobilize to reinforce our negotiating demands. That's how we will defeat white minority rule in South Africa. So the ANC and SACP and other formations urgently organized lots of local gatherings, advertised with posters of Comrade Chris's face, to kind of reach communities and communicate to them with this message. And Comrade Chris, of course, was in demand and was kept extremely busy. So busy, in fact, that he couldn't literally physically go to all of the meetings at which he was advertised. And so in those challenging days, another member of the Hani family, Chris Hani, said, you must go and address some of these meetings in the Vaal Triangle. And so I was wheeled out to speak at some of these 1,000-strong gatherings of angry people in the Vaal Triangle and the other areas, on the back of a truck often, an empty veld outside of informal settlements. And the crowd, obviously expecting their hero, Chris Hani, to arrive, were wondering what this Mlungu was doing here. Okay. Fortunately, some recognized me as being a sort of junior associate of Chris Hani. And when I said that, look, I'm bearing a message from Chris Hani, there was a degree of acceptance. So happily, this evening's event is obviously in a very different time and a very different context. But it's not a time without its own challenges, its own frustrations, and its own struggle imperatives. Chris Hani, as the Vice-Chancellor has said, was born in 1942 into deep rural poverty in the village of Sabalela in the Koffingbarber district of Transkei. His father was a migrant laborer, and his mom, like many African women, eked out the barest of survival livelihoods for herself and her family. Chris was baptized, by the way, baptized in the Catholic Church. He was baptized as Tempesile Martin, okay? And Chris was actually the name of his brother, which he adopted in exile as his nom de guerre when he went into exile. As with so many South Africans across the generations, including the current young generation in our country, Chris's first direct exposure to politics came, as it happens, on the terrain of educational struggles. As the Vice-Chancellor said, in 1954, while he was at school in Koffingbarber, some of his teachers were sacked for protesting against the introduction of Bantu education. And Chris, much later, reflecting on this, in his own words said, the purpose of Bantu education was, and I quote him, to indoctrinate black pupils to accept and recognize the supremacy of the white man over the blacks in all spheres. This angered and outraged us and paved the way for my involvement in the struggle. So he attributes that particular set of experiences to his initial politicization. And so we see here the beginnings of what was a lifetime of radical African nationalism. Okay, let me repeat that, of radical African nationalism. Hani sailed through school. He was a voracious learner. And in 1991, the party asked him to write some autobiographical notes, some brief notes. Solly is well familiar with him. And much to our frustration, we wanted him to talk about all of his wonderful military exploits and so on. He was very terse about those. Now, I was in Lusaka. We crossed over into the Wankie Reserve, and for three months we fought a battle and so on. What he spent most of his time on was recalling his early experiences and educational experiences. Okay, very interestingly. And so one of the things he recalled was, and I quote again, "My early Catholicism, okay, led to my fascination with Latin studies and English literature. These studies in these two courses were gobbled up by me, and I became an ardent lover of English, Latin, and Greek literature, both modern and classic." Okay, and as it was Alvi recalling it, I also recall similar events. In the early 1990s, Comrade Chris was still quoting from heart extensively passages from Shakespeare, not to show off, but because he often felt that Shakespeare could get across a political point that he wanted to get across more effectively. And so we find two apparently contradictory early influences, which became lifelong influences in Chris: a righteous black nationalist anger, and this apparently strange lifelong and love and enthusiasm for texts that we would normally consider to be the pillars of so-called Western civilization: Shakespeare, classical Latin, classical Greek literature, and so on. But the contradiction is only apparent, because what he drew from the Western canon was a deep humanism. And again, let me quote, I think it's the last quote from Chris. "My studies of literature," referring to the so-called Western canon, "further strengthened my hatred of all forms of oppression, persecution, and obscurantism." If Comrade Chris was a patriotic African nationalist, and he was never a narrow nationalist. He didn't want to locate himself or the people of our country into a narrow Africanist quarantine. Okay. He was a nationalist, yes, but he was also a profoundly active internationalist. Now, at the time of the unbanning of the ANC and SACP in 1990, Hani had already become a legendary figure in South Africa, in townships, in rural areas, and so forth. He had been in and out of the country, operating out of Lesotho, operating out of Mozambique, operating out of Botswana. He was in and out, and so he was actually well known in many places. But it was especially amongst the rank and file of MK cadres that he was especially revered. Tami Mali, who was one of the early biographers after Comrade Chris's death, served with Chris in MK camps in exile. And he remembers Hani's deep empathy and commitment to sustaining the morale among younger combatants who had left the country, hoping to get a gun and return immediately back to South Africa. but exile often proved long and arduous. Some of the more dangerous places for ANC members were not inside of South Africa, but in what we call the forward areas. Comrade Albie Sachs is a living testimony of what the regime was doing, often with great ferocity and brutality elsewhere. In southern Africa, in southern Angola, there was an ongoing war with apartheid-backed UNITA forces, and many ANC comrades fell in Angola. Tami Mali, remembering the Chris of those periods, writes that Chris was, yes, a military leader when we needed a military leader, but he adds in his biography, he was also a father when we needed a father, a mother when we needed a mother, and a counselor when that was required. Now, on Friday, we will be marking Freedom Day. 24 years ago, millions of South Africans voted in our first ever one-person, one-vote, non-racial elections, bringing the curtain down on decades of at least formal white minority rule. I'm not suggesting that white privilege has disappeared, but formal white minority rule was abolished, basically, through that mass action of millions and millions of people voting 24 years ago. The year before, as we all know, on a Saturday of the Easter weekend of 1993, Comrade Hani, Chris left his Dawn Park home briefly to buy newspapers. And on his return, he was hailed in the driveway by a white man. Now, we don't know, obviously, what went through Hani's mind, but I'm guessing that he thought this was another neighbor, perhaps who, recognizing him from the media, wanted to engage him in debate, because this was happening all the time in those years. I remember, for instance, a John Robbie show on Radio SO2, 702. Mr. Hani, why are you still a communist? The Berlin Wall has collapsed. And Comrade Chris would respond without anger and without impatience, and he would explain the role of the SACP, not in Eastern Europe, but here in the cauldron of South Africa, a formation that pioneered progressive journalism and trade unions in South Africa, a party that for many years was the only non-racial formation in our country, not just by way of aspiration, but in terms right from the beginning of its actual membership. Mr. Hani, another white voice on the radio. The trouble with you communists is that you fail to understand humans are fundamentally selfish. And again, Hani would respond politely and carefully, and he would say that embedded in African cultures is the notion that motu ke motu ka batu babank. A person is a person because of other people. And then he would go on to say, but by the way, the classical Greeks also said the same thing, that we are fundamentally social beings. And all the great world's religions share this fundamental view of the fundamental social nature of human beings, and not this notion of dog eats dog, JSE kind of behavior. Okay. So perhaps as he turned around to engage Janusz Walusz, Comrade Chris was beginning to rehearse again these thoughts once more in anticipation of a discussion. We will never know. Public opinion surveys in the early 1990s found that Comrade Chris was by far, by a long stretch, the second most popular South African, after, of course, Nelson Mandela. At their trial, the convicted killers, Janusz Walusz and Clive Derby-Lewis, there were others in the plot who have not been exposed, confessed that their intentions had been to trigger an interracial civil war and thus the collapse of negotiations. And they nearly succeeded. Following the assassination, the country teetered literally on the brink as millions and millions of South Africans poured onto the streets. And the serving president at the time, you might have forgotten, F.W. de Klerk, went absent without leave, AWOL. It was said that he was holidaying somewhere, okay, as the country was literally teetering on the brink. And so the SABC, which was still controlled, obviously, by the apartheid regime, hurriedly wheeled out Comrade Nelson Mandela to make a stately presidential address to the nation. And Mandela repeated almost word for word the message that Comrade Chris had carried to communities in and around the Boipatong massacre. We share your anger, Mandela said. He told the overwhelming majority of South Africans, but direct your anger to ensuring that we finally compel the negotiators to set in stone, not later than a year from now, the date for one person, one vote democratic elections. And so the multi-party negotiations, which had disappeared, were immediately reconvened. And on the 27th of April, 17 days after Comrade Chris's assassination, the date for a first ever non-racial democratic elections was announced, 27th of April, 1994. Freedom Day didn't come free. On behalf of the Hani family, I'd really like to salute, as I've had the initiative of the student body here and the university at UCT to rename this building. There are, of course, cynics who will say that changing the name of a building or removing a statue or whatever changes nothing. They will be proved wrong if we embed this renaming within a wider process of social, economic, and cultural transformation of our universities and our wider society. A university is surely a place in which it is both possible and imperative to foster reflective thinking, rational discussion, debate which may be passionate but must be collegial and civil in character. A number of recent research studies have suggested that there is a serious decline in the world in general of reflective thinking and social solidarity. And some of these studies are suggesting that it has to do with the explosion of social media platforms and all of our addictive recourse to them. As you know, we become alone on our touchscreens in the midst of a crowd. We know from Comrade Chris's beloved Greek classics that there have long been demagogues in politics, okay? It's not a new phenomenon. And so we can't entirely blame social media in our current situation for the rise of demagogic populism around the world, but also here, with all of its lack of civility, its short-termism, its theatrics, and its intolerance of others. But certainly social media has become an important purveyor and adjunct to this brand of politics. I call to the stand as a witness, a hostile witness, of course, Donald Trump. The challenges of our society, that our society here in South Africa is currently facing, are embedded in the crises of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and all of them are still deeply marked racially, in gendered terms, and also geographical location, and of course, class terms. In times of crisis, rational thinking is often imperiled. We become inclined to short-termism, to magical leaps of faith, to sloganeering that substitutes for thoughtfulness. Consider the land question, a debate which has erupted over the last few months. Land is obviously an emotive issue in South Africa, and rightly so. Over 3.5 centuries, colonial and successive white minority regimes expropriated land and other assets from the indigenous majority, and not just the indigenous majority, but those who came as slaves and their descendants who came into South Africa, those who came as indentured laborers. Often we talk about land back to the African majority, but what are we saying to others who've also, because of their race, suffered brutal land dispossession, not least here in Cape Town? So land is a passionate and emotional issue, and we should understand that. But how do we have a rational discussion about how to address the land question in the 21st century? The debate currently, in my view, is cluttered with tweet-length assertions that hinder thoughtfulness. On the right, there are unfounded claims that we are moving towards a genocide of whites. From a conservative, and I would add propertied, liberal milieu, we are told that the sanctity of private property, as entrenched currently, and as entrenched in the Constitution, which it is not. Please read the Constitution. Please read the Property Clause, Section 25. There's a claim that the whole Constitution is under threat. Others resurrect the old Africanist slogan, Izweletu. Someone shouted it earlier as well. The land is ours. The land is ours. It was stolen. We will take it back forcibly and without compensation. And it's easy to understand why this has a spontaneous appeal, although it is noticeable that the return of the land is considerably more popular among a largely youthful, urbanized audience than the implicit and at times explicit idea of a return to the land for a vocation as a peasant farmer. Chris Hani reminds us that radicalism and populist demagoguery are not the same thing. Chris Hani did not engage people from a podium, shouting down at them, expecting hero worship, parading his military standing. He engaged directly and personally Empathy was an abiding feature, an interest in other people, their diverse backgrounds, their hopes, and their concerns. I hope that the new lecture theatre, or the renamed lecture theatre, which now bears the name Chris Hani, will be a forum, an appropriate forum for collective empowerment, for rational and reflective discussion and learning. I trust, in short, that it will earn the name Chris Hani. Thank you very much.
Jeremy, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I don't want to detract from the profound sort of message, but we are only having one renaming ceremony here today, not two. So the Max Sisulu renaming is actually not going to take place today, maybe at another stage. Okay. So I actually want to, before I ask Lindiwe to come and speak on behalf of the family, I'd like to invite the Vice-Chancellor Max Price, Dr. Max Price, and also Lindiwe and others to do the official unveiling. Lindiwe, your moment, can I please ask you to come forward to speak on behalf of the family? You need to do the thing. Do you need the mic?
No, I think it's fine. This is my life struggle. Vice Chancellor, Dr. Max Price, Uncle Minister Jeremy Cronin, Uncle Justice Albie Sachs, Chairperson of the Naming Committee, Mr. Norman Arendse, Executive Director and the Development Alumni, Dr. Russell Ali, Deputy Chair of NOBC, Ms. Edwina Brooks, SRP President, Mr. Mthobisi Ngomenzulu, Chairperson of SASCO UCT, Mr. Anati Katwa, SACP leadership, students, and all members of UCT faculty, and all protocol observed. I'd like to express apologies on behalf of my mother. She's unfortunately traveling, but as the President, Chairperson, Secretary General, and Vice President of the Hani family, she has justly deployed me. She has now reached retirement age, and she is now looking to the youth, which I consider myself. So unlike many of our leaders, she's not being forced out. She's gradually handing on the baton. You know, Daddy was always very passionate about education. He used to tell us he used to walk over 20 kilometers for primary school in Gofimvab. And he would tell us that over and over again, especially that he was barefoot. If we dare ask for anything, he would tell us about how fortunate and spoiled we are. He was an avid reader, and he was a scholar. My childhood memories are of Daddy. He used to have, as Uncle Albie and Uncle Jeremy have said, he used to have a big text of Shakespeare that he used to read to us over and over again. We didn't hear nursery rhymes. We heard all about Marxism and Shakespeare. And that is a passion that he actually passed on to his children. We are all avid readers. You know, he was MK, he was commander of staff, and he was a soldier, but it was at a time where it was necessary to take arms. I think he actually regarded himself more as an intellectual. The soldier thing came as just a byline of what he had to do. And I think he became more of a soldier because he realized he had to take a leadership position where he had to lead from the front. And then after that he died, and I think when I did a brief drive-by, UCT, that's a long story, why it was a drive-by. Do not follow my ways. But I was here for a year, and I think there was still so much excitement, and there was relief, and there was appreciation that we were allowed to be here. And there was also this wide-eye anticipation. But fast forward over 25 years later, and I think it's okay to say we are disappointed. I know I'm certainly disappointed in the leadership and where it has taken us. But I have to tell you that I am so proud of the UCT students for unashamedly and unapologetically fighting for a place in our history and carving a relevant future for African students. And the Hani family would really, really like to give a huge thanks to SASCO and the members for pushing this endeavor. Thank you. I personally do think names are very important, and I think name by name, these are the kind of things that bring about evolution and change. And a name means a whole lot because it means we are here to stay, and we belong. So thank you very much. We are humbled and we are appreciative as always. Thank you very much, UCT. Thank you.
Let me invite Edwina Brooks, and she'll close proceedings as well. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I think all the speakers have done a really great job in terms of acknowledging everyone present. And so I'm not necessarily going to repeat each and every name, so if I don't mention your name, please do not feel offended. I think everyone who is present here tonight, we might even have people here who have a personal story to tell or a memory, and so we're looking forward definitely to the informal engagement where we can share some of those memories and reunite with old friends. So the Vice-Chancellor led by mentioning everyone, so I just want to make sure that I thank the Vice-Chancellor and the university leadership, the Naming of Building Committee and the University Council, the Deputy Minister, Judge Albie Sachs, Mr. Jeremy Cronin and then Judge Albie Sachs who spoke. I also want to thank Lindiwe who spoke, and to the family, thank you for this incredible privilege and honor that we can have to be able to name one of our buildings after Chris Hani. So can we just give the family another round of applause, please? I would like to thank the South African Students' Congress, SASCO, and the SRC, and all other student leaders present here tonight. I know there are other student structures also present here tonight, and so you are also, we also thank you for your presence here tonight. And then Program Director, we want to thank you for doing a great job. Not only did you do a great job being a Program Director, but you also did your substantive role, which is trying to raise funds, so we thank you for that. We want to thank each and everyone who made tonight possible. So the Communications and Marketing Department, for the caterers, for the cleaning staff. It takes a huge team effort to pull off an event like this. So we want to thank you for making this happen tonight. And then and also to all of you present, we want to thank you for your presence and for celebrating this time with us tonight. And then I'm probably going to say something which might be career limiting. So I was a student, I was a rank and file member of SASCO when Chris Hani came to speak in the New Science Lecture Theatre. And the lecture theatre was packed. You can see people were sitting on the floor. But the most important thing that I think was missing from tonight that we had there was the revolutionary song and celebration. So I'm hoping that will still happen as we go and engage in cocktails and we share and we celebrate. So thank you all of you for being here tonight.